Hi, everyone.
Welcome.
Thank you for joining us for the Professional Development Workshop, Black Youth Thriving in STEM, Setting Optimal Conditions for Deep Learning in the Senior Sciences with Tigist Amdemichael. Today's program has been kindly funded by the Ministry of Education. We will be starting shortly at about 7 o'clock. We're just waiting for everyone to join this webinar. My name is Tukni. I'm a science educator with the Ontario Science Centre. I'll be your moderator for this program. Hello. So I would like to begin our workshop today with a land acknowledgement. I am joining you from my home in Takaranto. Tigist is also joining from her home in Takaranto. Takaranto is the territory and ancestral lands of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat and Anishinaabeg nations, which include the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the Chippewa, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. The Ontario Science Centre is located in Takaranto, which is governed by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant and Toronto Purchase Treaties, also known as Treaty 13. Some of you may be joining from other locations outside Toronto. We encourage you to learn more about the peoples, treaties, and histories of the lands that you live on. Two resources you might find helpful that were created by Indigenous peoples are www.whos.land and native-land.ca. In doing the land acknowledgement, I am reminded of my own roots as a settler, descendant from Vietnamese refugees. My parents, they came here and they settled in Toronto, hoping for a better life for themselves and for their children. I am very grateful to be able to live and work on this land alongside Indigenous peoples who have cared for this land and continue to care for this land since time immemorial. As educators, we have the privilege and power to learn, educate, and inspire others. Today, we have invited Tigist Amdemichael to initiate a conversation on setting optimal conditions for deep learning in the senior sciences for Black youth to thrive in STEM. Thank you for joining us today, Tigist.
Thank you so much, Tukni, for the warm welcome. I'm so excited tonight. My heart's pacing and racing because I'm so thrilled that I'm joining all of you in this space to discuss something that really matters to me. So if you give me a few seconds, I'm going to share my screen. All right. So welcome officially to Black Youth Thriving in STEM, Setting Optimal Conditions for Deep Learning. My name is Tigist Amdemichael, and I'm a science educator. And according to my latest seniority verifications, 22.5 years in the TDSB teaching science. I love every facet about science, and I hope to share some of who I am and the work that I do with you this evening. So I am thrilled at this tremendous opportunity to support the brilliance of young Black scholars. And I am looking forward this evening to co-creating conditions necessary for more stories of Black excellence in STEM. So my Ethiopian Eritrean heritage means that somehow I'm going to make this about conversation and coffee, and for us, the two go hand in hand. So this evening, I want you to imagine that we are together in an intimate space, that we are going to have a ceremony together. And those little cups that you see are called sinis. And the clay pot is the jebana, and that's where the coffee, the buna, is. And we're going to pour into those cups this evening happiness, imagination, aspiration, and trust in the service of our Black learners. So I am curious to know what's brought you here this evening, and I would love to know what's filling your cup and what are you most excited to learn about this evening. So if you want to put a word or a sentence fragment or a whole sentence in the chat, just so that as a community we can see our sense of purpose, I would love to see that. So again, what are you most excited to learn about this evening? Such beautiful words, right? Engaging, empowering, connecting, beauty. All of these things provide us with a sense of purpose, which is the next part that I want to look at. Okay, so as we take our first sip, I wanted to share with you why I teach. And it is really in the pursuit of self-actualization that's rooted in love, community, and service. I view each class that I've been a part of and will be a part of as a constellation. And I think we're that unique, we're that special. And we are literally stardust, and we have to live those realities in those classrooms. So I always think about how can I think and feel and act in ways that set conditions for me to live out my purpose, and for the learners that I serve to live out their purpose. And in thinking of this, I thought about the celebrated feminist scholar and cultural critic Bell Hooks, who just recently passed away and who had a tremendous influence in my early 20s, and still continues to have in my practice. And I think she did the best job of summing up what it is that I try to do. I celebrate teaching that enables transgressions and movement against and beyond boundaries. It is that movement which makes education the practice of freedom. I can't think of a more beautiful way to start our evening work, but by really meditating on that quote. I would like to think of myself as an engaged pedagogue, that I reflect on my teaching, my learning, my cultural positioning, and my personal experiences. I hope that I model epistemic humility. And as I continue to build community and honor individual experiences, I remain open. And I hope this evening and in all of our teaching and learning that we always remain open. And that's my hope. And I'm curious also what has brought you into teaching. And so if there's one word that describes it, or a feeling or an intent, if we can see that in the chat. So as a community, again, we can root ourselves to our purpose. Why do you teach? Love kids. It's all about love, to inspire, acts of service, making a difference, empowering. Oh my God, this is like, so rooting ourselves and grounding ourselves in love. And I'm going to make a plug here while we're doing it. All About Love by Bell Hooks is also another foundational text that drives my work. Thank you so much for sharing. All right. So this evening, the journey that I sort of mapped out was in the service of Black learners, in the service of pursuing STEM excellence. How do we begin this journey? How do we map it out? And for me, the journey that I've put forth is the journey that I've experienced in teaching in 22.5 years, and then my own experiences as a student of science. And as a Black woman, the experiences that I've had and kind of have informed my journey. So I think it's really important for us first to really think about pedagogical frameworks that would support our work and to know what those are. And then, true to the science educators that we are, I think it's important to set an inquiry that's very rich, that can drive our learning. And then when you design an experiment, you always think of the variables. So I thought about, like, what are 7 questions that I have for my practice that drive what I do? And how can I highlight those in the work that I do? And lastly, I think it's always important to leave with next steps for learning. Where will we take all of this theory and inquiry and actually apply it in our very classrooms? And at the end, as Tukni mentioned, we'll have a Q&A. So that's the way I'm mapping it out based on my experiences. I recognize that everyone's always different in the trajectory of where they're at. So I hope that you take this and you adapt it and you modify it to your needs and really begin the work together. So graduation always gives me the shivers. And it's good shivers, right? When we see our kids up on the platform and walking. So I'm going to go back to that very powerful quote from Bell Hooks. How do we make our pedagogy a practice of freedom, especially in the service of Black learners, who we know contend with instruction that does not address their experiences, backgrounds, and culture? So this summer, I was so fortunate to attend a conference where Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings was the keynote speaker. And if you know her, she's a distinguished pedagogical theorist. And as she was speaking, she opened up the conference with such a powerful question. And she said, how are the children doing? And I feel like in education, all of our conversations should always begin from that entry point. And I recognize that how the children are doing is dependent on to what degree my pedagogy, our pedagogy, is a practice of freedom. So to this end, she's been super generous, and she's actually offered us 2 very powerful theories that can drive our work. And the first is that of the educational debt that is owed to Black students. And this debt has historical, economical, social, political, and moral facets. And if you read her studies and when you analyze what we frequently in education call the achievement gap, we recognize then we don't really have an achievement gap. What we have is an opportunity gap. And that language really matters because it frames how we move and proceed. So again, think about it. Every time you hear the achievement gap, question, is it an achievement gap or is it an opportunity gap? And that's something I'd like to really address this evening. So as I said, Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings has given us 2 gifts, and the second gift is culturally relevant pedagogy, because that's how we begin addressing the educational debt. It has 3 central tenets. One is academic success, the second is cultural competence, and the third is social, political, critical consciousness. I often like to think of these 3 tenets as questions, as markers for me to reflect on what I'm doing in STEM education. So I'm going to present them to you as questions to think about. Are all learners experiencing academic success in STEM-related subjects? Are all learners developing or maintaining their cultural competence? And if we're thinking about what does cultural competence mean, it's the ability to work effectively and sensitively across cultural contexts. It involves learning, communicating, and connecting respectfully with others, regardless of differences. Culture can refer to an individual's race, class, gender, sexual orientation, religion, immigration, status, age, among many other things. All of these factors strongly influence people's lives and experiences. And the definition of cultural competence that I just shared with you comes from Learning for Justice, which has a lot of awesome resources on teaching social justice education. Lastly, our third question. Are all learners provided opportunities to develop their critical consciousness? And critical consciousness or social political consciousness is pioneered by the work of Paulo Freire in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, another brilliant text to read if we have not done so already. And what does it mean, this critical consciousness? So we're going to equip our learners with the knowledge and skills for them to analyze systems of privilege and oppression, and then have them commit to action against these very systems. And this requires critical practice of devising, implementing, producing solutions, reflecting on those solutions. And the picture that I put there is one to inspire those of us who are teaching grade 10 and across actually all of our subjects, that when we teach about climate justice, we can't divorce it from racial justice. So at this point, I'm curious to know which of these 3 central tenets, and you can have more than one, is an area of growth for you. So we're just going to launch a Zoom poll to see as a group which of these 3 central tenets is an area of growth for us.
All right, I think that's about enough time. So we're going to close the polls in 3, 2, 1.
That's so interesting, right? 20% at academic success, 45% at cultural competence, and 62% at social, political, critical consciousness. The last one is the highest, and that does not surprise me because I heard Dr. Bettina Love speaking recently, and she's another, she's got some pretty powerful ideas to explore. And she had said that that's the hardest one in education, the one that's the least done, and potentially the one that we all need to work on, that I know that I actively still work on. And we will never finish the journey because we're always going to keep learning more and more. So thank you so much for sharing where you're at in your journey. And then when I'm looking at the next part, there's also another very important pedagogical framework that comes from Dr. Geneva Gay and her work, and she has culturally responsive pedagogy. And this theory approaches a learner's multiple social identities from an asset-based perspective. So for me, Tigist, as a learner, it recognizes my background, my social identities, my cultural identities, and my linguistic diversity. And those very tools that sometimes are used against students are the very tools and gifts that actually build up their STEM efficacy, their STEM identity, their STEM career aspirations. So we have a lot of theoretical grounding to actually do the work that we need to do. Very often you'll hear CRRP, and that's a combination of culturally relevant and culturally responsive pedagogy intertwined together. And so for me, just as we in science, a theory needs to be put to good use and needs to be put to practice. And I can't think of a better way to do that than generating a really rich inquiry question, which is what we ask our learners to do. So I'm sharing with you this evening the inquiry that I use to drive my own work in science education. So I really believe that if we have a robust inquiry-based learning program that's driven by culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, then more Black learners will engage and thrive in STEM-related courses because they will develop a positive STEM identity. So you'll appreciate that I used our if, then, because statements, right? And so as we go forward this evening, I'm asking you to adopt that inquiry and to think about to what extent does this hypothesis challenge or confirm your existing ideologies, values, and beliefs as to how you practice STEM education. Because this is going to be the action piece that we're going to walk away with. So is this hypothesis a movement against and beyond boundaries? I would like to think it is. And so as a good science educator, I'm going to say to all of you out there, go out and test this claim and let me know what you find, right? So we're ready to begin our journey together. At the start, we've got very powerful pedagogical frameworks. We've got a really, what I think a robust inquiry question. And now we can start thinking about the variables that are going to make things happen. And when I think of variables, I think of conditions. So what conditions do you think will support that very rich inquiry question that we just saw? And I'm going to put my slide back one so you have that in front of you. So if you can think of one condition that you can identify that will support this inquiry, and if you could drop it into the chat so we can all reflect and see what we're thinking before we begin our discussions, I would appreciate that. So what is one condition that could support this hypothesis? High expectations, communication, collaboration, and dialogue. Collaboration, strong relationships must be supportive in classroom environment, giving students voice, trust, removing barriers, student voice. Oh, I love that, epistemic freedom, high expectations from teachers, feedback loop, safety. Thank you so much for sharing your prior, what we come into the space of learning with. Oh, it's on fire, I love that. So I was thinking that a good starting point is also to define what anti-Black racism is, where it is, and how it manifests itself. So I'm going to share a definition with you from the Ontario Anti-Racism Act of 2017. Anti-Black racism is prejudice and attitudes and beliefs, stereotyping and discrimination that is directed at people of African descent and is rooted in their unique history and experience of enslavement and its legacy. Anti-Black racism is deeply entrenched in Canadian institutions, policies, and practices to the extent that anti-Black racism is either functionally normalized or rendered invisible to the larger society. Anti-Black racism manifests in the current educational marginalization of African Canadians, which includes unequal opportunities, remember that opportunity gap we spoke about, disproportionately low academic achievement, lessened experiences of well-being, and overrepresentation in the disciplinary and special education data. Which brings me to, if we are to address anti-Black racism as it exists in STEM education, we need to really understand how prejudice and power combine to oppress Black learners. So if we're going to disrupt deficit narratives of what Black learners can do, it first really means reflecting on our own very identities. We need to come to know our prejudice as it manifests in our attitudes and beliefs and tendencies towards negative stereotyping. Sometimes if you can close your eyes and do an experiment and see, when you think of the STEM learner, what comes up, that's part of the work. And as we reflect on our identity markers, such as our race, our gender, our ethnicity, our socioeconomic status, our sexual orientation, our religion, our age, our abilities, and so forth, think about how all of those identity markers impact our relations with Black learners. And there's a really good read for this work that I just couldn't put down. And the book is titled A Guide for White Women Who Teach Black Boys. And that is definitely an exercise. There's lots of exercises about how you reflect about your own identity. So I definitely recommend that. So really the journey always doesn't begin with the learner, it really belongs to us. And we need to work on our own cultural competence, as we identified earlier. We need to work on our own critical consciousness so that we're continuously reflecting. It might mean journaling, reading extensively. You can't read enough. That's my philosophy. And more importantly, you always have to remain in dialogue with your learners, their families, with your colleagues, and with the communities where our learners are from. But ultimately, that inquiry has to lead us to action. And part of that means overcoming our fears of addressing race and racism. It cannot be taboo in our classrooms. We need to embrace vulnerability. We need to embrace discomfort, because this is the ultimate route to understanding the lived realities and experiences of Black learners. Too often, if we are colorblind, asserting that we don't see the race of our learners, we fail to acknowledge then the impacts of anti-Black racism, and we cannot do the work of undoing the impacts of white supremacy. So white supremacy, as described by the scholar Frances Lee Ansley, is the political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources. It's the conscious and unconscious ideas of white superiority and entitlement being widespread. It's the relations of white dominance and non-white subordination that are daily reenacted across a broad array of institutions and social settings. And if we're thinking about what does that mean, it takes us to our second question, which is, in our work, are we addressing systemic and institutional barriers in STEM education? That question requires us to interrogate existing power structures as a natural reflex. How is racism operating on a systemic and institutional level in our schools and districts? Think about the years of streaming Black learners endured. How can we do differently this time? I have taught applied courses. I've been complicit in that system. Why did I not act earlier? These are some of the questions that I think about. And so if we're developing solutions and we're examining our STEM programs, part of our critical consciousness would mean that we would ask questions like, how are injustice and inequality operating in our specialized STEM programs? Who's getting counseled out of taking senior science courses? Who's participating in extracurricular science programming, which I don't feel is necessarily extra, but is quite necessary? And where do we allocate our resources for STEM-based programs? And I'm curious, do you have an additional question that we should be asking? So if you do, please feel free to drop it in the chat. How are school leadership supporting the work? So really disrupting the status quo means that we're actively developing these reflexes so that we can see what we need to do to change, right? How we can remove barriers. So how are we humanizing STEM is also another really brilliant question. So while we're doing these two things, we're reflecting internally and externally, then I feel that we're in a good place for our next step. And I recognize this is a time for me to take in a little deep breath. I normally don't talk this much. And so maybe it's time to pour another cup of coffee. Don't worry, it's like a cereal dilution. It gets weaker and weaker as the evening goes. Traditionally, we actually have 3 rounds in the ceremony, so there's more to come. So if I'm going to be reflecting on myself and working on dismantling systemic barriers, and I then feel like I'm in a good place to begin conversations about curriculum instruction and assessment. So the next series of questions that you're going to be looking at, you can consider them as variables that nurture, right, that feed the potential of Black learners who are in our classes. And the sequence of questions does not necessarily mean that you have to do them in that order. And in fact, all of those variables have to be operating simultaneously because they actually compound one another, right? They really support each other. So let's look at our first question. Is the STEM learning environment an affirming space for Black learners? So I'm imagining that if a space is affirming, then Black learners can freely imagine seeing themselves as future scientists, technologists, engineers, and mathematicians. They don't have to leave who they are, all of those identities that we spoke about when they enter our rooms to engage with science education. They bring their whole self into that space. So the very first thing that I think about is getting to know Black learners as individuals. And we do that by connecting to their unique dreams and aspirations. Inquire, for example, what gifts do they present? What learning styles do they prefer? How can their multiple social identities drive lesson planning? How can I incorporate identity-based responses in my questions? So those are some of the things that I'm thinking about, and there's much, much more. But the idea here that I'm trying to get at is that Black learners are not a monolithic group. They are beautiful in their diversity. So we need to center their identity, their agency, and their power in the work that we do. And as we engage with Black learners, we must consider what Archer, Dewitt, and Osborne in their 2015 paper frame as the intersection of inequalities that race, ethnicity, gender, and social class pose for Black students. And Bell Hooks was actually one of the first theorists to give us this idea of intersectionality. And it's really important to remember that, because Black girls, for example, face both race-based and gender-based barriers as they pursue STEM. So if we know the individual learner, it's also important that centering Black learners also means centering their families and communities. For example, do we inquire into what funds of knowledge Black families bring into STEM topics? Do we invite parents and caregivers as contributors to the learning? And there's a lot that we can learn from elementary folk in high school, because we so often have we don't form a lot of deep relationships with our parent community. And the one time that I think that we do is when it comes to reporting periods, right? But I was actually also reflecting on, to what degree do we involve Black learners and their families with regards to our assessment and evaluation? And I say that because there's a lot in the literature that says that when evaluations and assessments are not co-constructed, it just leaves us open to biases coming into our work. And often those biases can be harming. So as we work towards the 7 fundamental principles of assessment, as outlined in Growing Success, then we are truly supporting learners. So think about your assessment and evaluation. Is it fair, transparent, and equitable? Does it support all students? Is it carefully planned? Is it clearly communicated? Is it ongoing and varied? Ongoing descriptive feedback? Does it promote self-assessment? All of these things, when practiced, really, really, really allow learners to flourish. And again, I am curious, because this is a big area of growth for all of us. If there is one here that you feel, or more than one, that you are working towards. Tukni, I think we can launch our second poll.
So this is a multiple choice poll. So if you want to select more than one answer, you can. And I'll close the poll in about, I'll give you 10 more seconds.
Mhm.
All right, 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1.
That's so interesting. So there's quite, it looks like there's lots of areas for us to work on, right? And promoting self-assessment, ongoing descriptive feedback, ongoing and varied opportunities are mentioned as lots. I know that for me, that one area that I'm constantly working on is feedback, because feedback has to acknowledge the learner while promoting growth. And there's always that tension. So when I was thinking about assessment and evaluation, it brought me to this question: is your curriculum and instruction reflective of Black learners' cultures and experiences? Because that's when we have really rich assessments. And to that end, I was thinking that the purpose of curriculum instruction and assessment is to really fuel learner growth. And none of us went into education to sift and sort learners. And so when we don't provide mirrors for Black learners to see themselves reflected in our text selection, in our videos, in our experiments, in our lesson plans, then we are asserting that they don't belong. And when we use learning materials that distort history and exhibit negative stereotypes, we're also sorting. And then if we don't have windows for non-Black learners to see the contributions past and present of Black communities in STEM, especially beyond February, when we also lack cultural relevance and dismiss students' funds of knowledge, including the languages, we are sifting. So we need to challenge the premise that what matters most is our subject expertise in secondary sciences, because the most important thing is learner expertise. It's knowing our learners. And I can't stress enough that ours is a profession of critical care, trust, integrity, and respect. And this idea of windows and mirrors, when I was thinking at it from the optics point of view, the source of light is also really important, right? And that source of light should be the student. And so we have to make sure that all of our students can actually thrive and shine, and that they need opportunities. Black learners need to see themselves reflected in their day-to-day learning environments. So when I was developing this, one of the things that really struck me, that kept coming up in my mind, was what happens when there's an erasure and when there's a forgetting. So what you see in the screen is my name in Amharic. And from the age of 3 to the age of 7, I used to read, write, and speak Amharic excellent. And when we came to Canada at the age of 7, the disposition was, quick assimilation, get the children to speak English as fast as possible. And so in that process, I actually lost a big part of my identity. And it's something that I'm trying to reclaim now. And I'm glad that all of those structures are still up there for me to access. But I often think about, in science, there's a lot of good research coming out about how do we use languages that students bring into the space to actually support the science learning. And so we need to be very sensitive to culture and language, and also the very specific nature of science education and science language that can be kind of exclusionary, like exclude kids from participating, and bridging those pieces together. So as we explore this idea of windows and mirrors, I want to do a little test, a good kind of test. But in the chat, I'm going to ask this question and you can respond. How many white European male scientists can you name? So think about all the formulas and all the people that we refer to as we're teaching, and let's see how many we can drop in the chat as quickly as we can. I was on the subway when I was thinking about this question. I'm like, okay, grade 9, Ohm's law, grade 10, maybe it's Snell, grade 11 chemistry, it's Avogadro. Then you think about the gas laws, right? Yeah, I'm seeing them. Yeah, Gay-Lussac, Dalton, oh my God, Bohr, Rutherford, like it's just, so think about this as a mirror. So if we're holding this up as a mirror, all we're seeing is white male scientists. Now, in the chat, I'm going to drop another question, which is, how many African scientific achievements can you describe past and present? So I see the Green Belt movement. Not enough, steam engine. So one of the things that's really fascinating is that I came across this from somewhere else, but typically when you have an African technology, so like even the clay pot that I showed earlier this evening where we make our coffee, it's often typically objectified as art and not as technology. So even the very technological and scientific innovations that we have remain hidden. And so I've been really deeply thinking about, if a Eurocentric curriculum has been the norm, how can we learn and teach different STEM stories? And what if we go on the hypothesis that if we provide a mirror by using an Afrocentric STEM curriculum, what will that do for our Black learners? Many African cultures, including my own, embrace collectivism. And this resonates with many Black learners whose families hold a collectivist worldview. So there was this really interesting study by Burbank, Shockley, and Laniles, and it was such a beautiful paper to read. But they demonstrated that when you bring in African-centered elements into STEM programming, Black learners thrive. So they designed this program for middle school Black boys, and it was centered on science, African cultural connections. And they did this while they were engaged in creating STEM innovations and technology. And the results of their study was quite phenomenal. 75% of the learners reported greater knowledge in STEM related topics. 74% reported more confidence in mathematics and science, and 70% reported a disposition towards choosing STEM-based career. So this data clearly shows we can increase Black student STEM achievement if we use inquiry-based instructions supported by culturally relevant pedagogy. So I hold you to that, to look into that. What does that look like? And there was an example that I wanted to share this evening, which was maybe about 10 years ago when I found out that Ethiopians had come up with a binary system for trading coffee. And the math is phenomenal. And the kids love it because you do the math without using fractions. But that's something that you never think about, or how the agriculture is a type of science. And so if the coffee is rooted in that place, how many of us know those origins or that history? There's just so much richness to explore there. Which brings me to another question, which is, do you hold high expectations for Black learners? And I'm sorry if I'm missing stuff in the chat. I plan to copy the chat and read it later. And I definitely can't wait to engage with you in the Q&A. So findings from Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, her research showed that successful teachers of African-American learners, one thing they all had in common was that they had very strong beliefs that all children can learn. And these teachers had meaningful relationships with the learners, their families, and their communities. And we have to remember that some Black learners have internalized negative stereotypes about their capabilities from years of conditioning, from adults who technically were entrusted in their care. So we need to understand the phenomenon of what's called the stereotype threat, which is where a learner is so distressed that they will fulfill a negative stereotype that their fears actually drive them to fulfill that. So one beautiful way you can show love is by setting really high expectations coupled with a rigorous curriculum with culturally scaffolded supports. That's critical care, because sometimes we can say we care, but if we're lowering our expectations to make it easier, that's not care. So critical care is a very important concept here, which brings me to Zaretta Hammond. But before I get there, I wanted to read to you 5 conditions that Cornick in 2012 wrote about as being necessary for Black girls to be able to identify themselves as an engineer. And as I tell you what these 5 factors are, think about how many of them will need to involve a positive relation with an educator. 1, self-efficacy beliefs. 2, academic identity. 3, social identity. 4, engaging learning experiences. And the 5th one is support and encouragement from teachers and parents. So in her book, Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain, Zaretta Hammond writes about promoting an authentic engagement and rigor among culturally and linguistically diverse students using neuroscience, so that definitely resonated with me, and culturally responsive practices. So she describes how we educators can be warm demanders by building positive relations with our learners. So I'm going to share a quick excerpt with you as she speaks. And I'm thinking as we're watching that we also want to think about the role of inquiry and how it interrupts what we call a pedagogy of poverty. And a pedagogy of poverty is this idea that, you come in, you're the teacher, you give the information, they sit down, they work through some sheets, they replicate that in an assessment evaluation, and then you repeat that cycle. That's a pedagogy of poverty. So how can inquiry shift us away from that? How can we fill the kids with richness? So I'm just going to play this now.
If we think about inquiry as the great cognitive equalizer, there are a couple of things that we want to remember. This idea of curiosity over compliance. This is not about getting kids to be quiet while you go over some stuff and tell them what they should be thinking. This is creating an environment where it's okay for them to have a little chaos, to have the quiet hum of real learning where you hear the murmur of kids talking. And how will you orchestrate that? Where you're just not shooting from the hip, but you want children to engage in this kind of curiosity. So you set your classroom up to do that. Children that come from collectivist cultures learn by doing. So the degree to which you have real experiments, real maker spaces for them becomes really important. The next is questioning over quiet. Where will the children get an opportunity to ask their questions or to debate or to listen to their peer or classmate? Because Vygotsky also talks about social cultural learning, that we learn better when we're talking to each other. Another hallmark of a collectivist culture, the opportunity to talk to stimulate thinking. The last is this idea of errors as information. Errors are information, not confirmation of low intelligence. So making sure that our children know that not only do we have norms of behavior in the classroom, but we have norms of cognition, that if we get feedback, we also are making mistakes, and that those mistakes are information.
So I'd like to pick up on that last piece that she mentioned, which is that the idea that mistakes are information is worth meditating and acting on. And the next question that kind of connected that for me was, to what degree are real world issues driving the STEM learning? And I asked that because I think very early in my career, I'd made the mistake of divorcing inquiry from real world issues. But it's pretty powerful when we combine the two together. And Coleman and his colleagues in their research found that Black and Latinx students desire to serve their communities by solving problems that better humanity while shattering stereotypes about what Black and Latinx students can do. So persisting and engaging in STEM learning happened when they could actually see STEM careers that could help and serve their community. And in order for us to get to that space, we have to think about how we perceive subjects like math, science, technology, and engineering as objective studies. So I was going to do a poll, but I see that time is ticking, so I'm just going to move on, because I don't see STEM as being neutral. And if all we do is have learners just inquiring scientifically, and you're designing prototypes and you're coding to solve challenges, but it's not really intentionally addressing systems of oppression and privilege in their inquiry, then we're kind of complicit in promoting STEM as a neutral endeavor. We need to acknowledge and discuss racism as it exists in STEM and the science education Black learners receive. And we need to think about how scientific racism, both past and present, has been employed to support anti-Black racism and white supremacy, so that the social political climate where the science is done and where the science is taught needs to be examined. So that's part of building up the critical consciousness of our students. So I was thinking even about how mapping the Human Genome Project created new concerns about how the technology would be used to justify racism and support racial profiling. So it's vital that we use local and global, and there are some that would argue that no one's fully local or global, that we're both now, because we're just so interwoven, that STEM-based learning, in order for it to be motivating, needs to address these very complex issues. And we're so fortunate in science that we have a vehicle directly through the curriculum to do this work. And that's through our Relating Science to Technology, Society, and the Environment strand, right? And we have that in every single strand through our overalls and through our specific expectations. And more importantly, it's in the achievement chart, where we're asked to assess students' abilities to make connections between science, technology, society, and the environment, and ultimately to propose courses of practical action. And so if you're looking for a place to start, use your existing assessment and your existing curriculum to find places where students want to act on issues that matter to them. And I wanted to leave you with one example tonight, and there was just so many when I was brainstorming, but the one that I wanted to highlight was artificial intelligence. And so here is an example where we have role models, two very powerful scientists, Timnith Gebru and Joy Buluwani. And they are both scientists that are saying, hey, why are things the way they are? Who's in power? And let's intervene and act on the system. So I'm just going to give you a clip to kind of like spark your imagination about what you could show learners.
Hi, I'm Joy, and I research how computers detect, recognize, and classify people's faces. In my TED featured talk, I spoke about my experience with the coded gaze, my term for algorithmic bias. The system I was using worked well on my lighter-skinned friend's face, but when it came to detecting my face, it didn't do so well, until I put on a white mask. After my talk was posted, I tested my speaker image profile across.
So I'm going to stop there given our time, but you can definitely look up the gender shade study. But here is an example of Black joy and Black brilliance. You've got these two phenomenal scientists who are looking at algorithmic bias, coded gaze, and they are actually intervening, and they both have institutions where they are actively working to make sure that AI is more inclusive. So you can launch a query from here, you can study the abstract of the paper, you can do a predict, explain, and observe. But also this is a mirror. So imagine Tigist is little, she's in high school, and she gets an opportunity to see this. What kind of impact does that have on the learner? Even when I look at it, I'm like, that's just so super awesome. And the co-author, Timnit Gebru, actually says, scientists are some of the most dangerous people in the world because we have this illusion of objectivity. So as educators, particularly as science educators, we need to kind of figure out where we stand there and what learning we need to do to overcome that bias. Lastly, I wanted to really mention the importance of connecting Black learners to STEM programs that are after school in the summer or their enrichment programs, because the career and mentorship life planning goals also happen external to the school and internally, things that we call extracurricular, like our science fairs, our STEM-based clubs. These are the spaces where we need to see Black learners also thriving. So think about what conditions are necessary to make that happen in your space. And as we move forward, think about how will you continue learning, acting, and reflecting on the very things that we've discussed this evening. And it's important that as we move forward, that we take theory and we practice it into action. I'm going to leave you with that inquiry question because I'm curious to know when you test out that claim, what you find. And it's important, I think, for us to form a community with our colleagues to do this work together, to support each other in our endeavors, and to make sure that the work is done also with our learners and their families. And I was thinking also, how will we know that we've been successful? And that brought me back to Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings when she says, when Black students are thriving academically, socially, culturally, and politically, we know that we're actually doing the work. So look for those indicators and build them with your community. So I want to thank you all for joining me this evening. I feel so privileged to have had this conversation with you. I really want to thank the Science Center for allowing us to have this conversation. They've been an awesome team to work with. And I also wanted to thank all the learners who've informed who I am. And I also want to thank my parents, who are my first teachers, who've made all of those variables happen in my life. And so I'm very grateful for that. And I'm going to stop the presentation right now. Thank you so much.
So thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. And again, thank you so much, Tigist. It has been such an enriching experience working with you and being here in the webinar that you've put so much of your heart and soul and experience into. It's really been absolutely wonderful. So take care, everyone. We hope you have a really lovely evening.
Thank you so much. Have all a lovely evening.